Hey everybody, welcome back to the 24th episode of Open Source for Business, brought to you by Open Teams. My name is Henry Badgery, and today I talk with Dawn Foster, who's the Director of Open Source Community Strategy at VMware. Dawn and I had a lot of fun talking through the many lessons she's learned over the past 20 years working with open source communities. And for anyone who's interested in assessing the risks and evaluating open source projects that your company's using, then I promise you will learn a lot if you listen to this podcast. Now, whether you are a user, developer, manager, or if you're just curious about the industry, then Open Teams is the place to find the information, news, training, and support that you need to thrive with open source software. Now that the introductions are out of the way, let's dive in. Well, Dawn, thank you so much for joining me on the podcast today.
Thanks for having me. I'm happy to be here.
I'm very happy you're here and we joined. I know we had a little chat a few weeks ago and I've been really excited to get you on the podcast, so thank you. Just to give the audience a bit of context, so you are the Director of Open Source Community Strategy at VMware at the moment, but I'd like to get a bit of an idea of how you really got into your position today, how you got into open source.
Yeah, so I sort of joke that I got into open source a bit accidentally. I came out of university with a computer science degree in the mid-90s, and I ended up as a Unix systems administrator. And I worked for a manufacturing company who did not like to pay for anything related to IT. So I ended up using a bunch of open source software just because it was what I could use. It was what we could afford. It was what I could do. And so I used a ton of open source software. And then, I did some different things at that company, but fast forward a few years, I ended up at Intel around 2000 or so. And they needed someone to help them evaluate which open source developer tools, right, and Linux developer tools as well, even the non-open source ones like Borland. They wanted me to look at which ones were likely to be strategic for Intel in the future, meaning we should put some time and effort into optimizing those for the latest processors. And a big part of that was evaluating the communities behind these open source projects. And I ended up with this project because they looked at me and they were like, well, you did Unix, which is like Linux, and you know what open source is, which is more than a lot of people back in 2000. And so that's kind of how I ended up with the project. And I got more and more fascinated by how these communities operated. And, because looking at it from the outside, it just looks like chaos. It's just people throwing code all over the place. And how does this even work? But there are really defined structures, and we know that now, and it's easier to find, and we have better ways of defining governance and the way these projects work and how the communities operate. But I get so fascinated by that. I eventually sort of turned it into a full-time job. And so I've been doing open source community and community strategy work for, I guess, a little over 20 years.
Wow, that's incredible. And you would have seen the communities completely just change in terms of how they operated. We all moved to GitHub. I think they became a lot more, with technology, they worked a lot more and collaborated a lot more over the internet in a much better way. So what are some of the things you actually saw change over those years and evolve, I guess, from when you started to now within communities and how they operate? I know that you said there were additional governance structures now. We get a better idea of how they run, but I thought it'd be nice to really talk about that evolution of the community and how it works.
Yeah, absolutely. There's a lot of things that have changed over the years. The tooling is certainly one, which you mentioned. So it used to be you'd send patch diffs to mailing lists and people would evaluate them and then eventually merge them into whatever source code repository you were using. And that it's a bit of a hurdle for new contributors for sure. The tools we use now, GitHub makes it really easy to contribute something new to a project for the first time with a pull request. So the tools have definitely evolved quite a bit. I also think that the behavior in communities has evolved significantly in the years. So codes of conduct weren't really a thing before. And some of those communities were really toxic. And the Linux kernel community, for example, was super toxic. And you either had to deal with it or you had to leave. And now, most communities have codes of conduct that are enforced. And, we know now that you just can't let those bad apples run rampant through your community because it makes everyone miserable and it's not a good place to be. And so I think that communities now are a lot more proactive about frankly, booting people, even if they have great code and they're, doing interesting things. If nobody wants to work with them, I think we've gotten a lot more proactive about booting them out of the communities. But the other thing that's changed a lot is just the conversations around open source, whether it's in the community or with companies. So in 2000, every conversation started with, I'm afraid of the GPL. Will this contaminate all of my code? I'm terrified of open source. This was back during the SCO IBM lawsuit. And so people were just terrified of open source. They weren't sure that they could use it. They were, they were super afraid. And so every conversation was convincing them, no, it's okay. You can use this. It's going to be fine. And now people take it for granted. I mean, look at big projects like Kubernetes that, run a lot of just the, modern infrastructure.
I think definitely, yeah, there's been a huge advancement in licenses, but also just the communities, like you said, and how they are very different. They're no longer as toxic. Maybe there are a few toxic ones, but we're definitely advancing in a great direction. And over the years, what has been your favorite open source project that maybe you've worked with or that you've seen from the sideline, and why?
Oh my gosh, it is so hard to pick a favorite. But I would have to say Migo, which was around, gosh, 2010, 11. It was a mobile open source operating system. I worked at Intel at the time, and this was kind of a joint project with Nokia. It was under the Linux Foundation, but it was a lot of people from Intel and Nokia participating in it. And it evolved out of Nokia's MIMO community and out of Intel's Moblin community. And I met so many fascinating people in that community. It was just I had so much fun working. So I was one of the two community managers. We had me, and then we had someone from Nokia, and so he had coverage kind of during the European side. And at the time, I lived in Portland, Oregon, so I had coverage during the U.S. side. And I just met so many fascinating people. And that is my favorite thing about open source in general, is that I have made so many amazing friends over the years, and deep connections and deep relationships with people that we've never worked at the same company, we've never lived in the same town, but they're people who, when they come to the UK, will literally stay in my house. And some of my
Wow.
dearest friends are people that and you see them at all the conferences, so you see them and hang out with them for kind of a week at a time, several times a year. And so you do get to know these people really well. And so I have friends all over the world. I can go most places and find someone that I can go to lunch with, or whatever, regardless of which city I'm in, which country I'm in. And I find that fascinating.
It definitely is fascinating. And talking with you, I can just tell that you're very a community oriented person. You can understand how the developers are working, you understand how the communities are working, you're friendly, you're bubbly. What are some of the key characteristics of a good community manager these days? How do you find that great community manager?
Oh yeah, so I would say that the biggest thing to look for is actually probably flexibility and broadness of scope. So one of the things also interesting about open source communities is every single one of them is different. So they're not all the same. And part of the reason I've been able to do this for more than 20 years is because every new community that I get involved with is different in some way. And there's always something new, there's something different. And so I do mostly community strategy now, so I'm not directly managing communities. But when I was, my approach to it was different for every single community that I managed, because you go in and you look at things, and you talk to people, and you figure out what works in that community and what doesn't. And what I see is the role of a community manager in a lot of cases is, frankly, it's problem solving. It's looking at what's working and what's not, and being able to find the right people, find the right, maybe technologies, find the right approach to fix things that aren't working well and that are causing pain for people in the communities. So, one example of this was at Puppet. When I worked there, the first thing that I did, like first significant project, was to fix the contributor license agreement process. Now, that's not really a community manager thing, but that was the biggest pain point in the community, because, all the pull requests are on GitHub. The contributor license agreement was integrated into our ticketing system, which was Redmine. And so the developers had no way to know whether this person on the ticketing system was the same as this GitHub ID to be able to match their contributor license agreement. So, we built a built a bot, because there weren't a lot of bots that did this back at that point. But it's not really a community manager thing, but it was just such a problem in the community that fixing that allowed me to do other more community oriented things.
So you're really sitting in between all of these developers, and you're seeing how everything works, all of their interactions, all of their processes, and you're really the glue behind these open source projects. You're making sure it continues to work. You're making sure that it continues to improve. That can people want to actually contribute? Because I understand that must have been probably the biggest thing stopping for people from contributing to that open source project.
Yeah, it was stopping us from merging their contributions for sure. Yeah, and there are other things that are, I think, really important for community managers. One of them is being the person who knows who to talk to when something comes up. So it's not really networking, but it's being able to make connections between people. So if I know that, Joe on one side of the project is working on this thing and Betsy on the other side is working on something that's almost exactly the same, I should be connecting those two people. And so I actually spent a lot of time behind the scenes, connecting people and pointing people to things, and sort of in a way being the person behind the curtain, in a lot of ways. So there are different approaches to community management and leadership. There's the I'm a rock star and I want everyone to know that I'm the leader of this community and I'm really important. That's one approach. That's not the approach that I put in favor. The way I look at it is, if I am so visible in the community that I'm the only one doing things, then that's not managing the community. That's doing all of the work and not letting anyone else do anything. So I spend a lot of time trying to convince people to work on things. I'll convince people to give talks at conferences. I'll convince people to submit a pull request for something that they're interested in. And so I spend a lot of time behind the scenes convincing people to do things.
And being so involved with the community, you've obviously learned a lot over the years about, like I said, how everything works, but also the risks, and also how you actually evaluate open source software projects that a company is using. I know that's something which you have a lot of experience doing. So could you talk a bit about how companies listening can actually go about that process?
Yeah, that is something I've become really passionate about lately. And so that's definitely more on the community strategy side of things than community management. But, and it's something that I've started thinking more about, in the past couple of years at Pivotal and then at VMware. And, I start looking at some of the projects that we rely on, and thinking, realizing that there are lots of risks associated with this. So the biggest example recently was OpenSSL. This was a couple of years ago. So OpenSSL is a technology that almost everyone in the world uses, right? It's this open source project. It's used by almost every company in the world. It's massive. And there was a huge security vulnerability in there. I think it was in the cryptography library. And we all learned that there was a couple of people part-time maintaining this project, and that was it. They had no funding, no resources, and all of a sudden there's this gigantic security vulnerability that's affecting almost every company in the world, and there's no one to fix it. They did fix it, and some companies kind of pulled together to get some resources to help improve this particular situation. But it gets you thinking about how many others of these are there, and what are some of the other risks associated with it. So you've certainly got the not enough contributors, not enough maintainers, risk, but licensing risk is another one that comes up a lot recently. So MongoDB and Redis relicensed. The biggest recent example was probably Elastic, when they relicensed Elasticsearch and Kibana and put those under what is not an open source license. So those are no longer open source projects. And the license that they put them under is problematic for a lot of companies. Our lawyers took one look at it, and we do a lot of open source. We use a lot of different licenses. We have some favorites, but they took one look at this license and they were like, nope, we are not using anything under this license within the company. And we have Elasticsearch embedded in a lot of our products. And I've been talking to a lot of other big open source program offices who are there. We're all in the same situation because Elasticsearch and Kibana are prolific. across the industry. We use them for lots of things within products. And now all of a sudden it's not open source, and you can pay for it. There's some forks you can embrace, and some of those are problematic too. But that's another big example of a risk that you should be thinking about for these projects that you incorporate in your products. And one of the reasons you end up with this particular risk, the licensing risk, is because it's not under a neutral foundation. It's owned by an individual company, and they can kind of do what they want with it. We've seen this with other open source projects. And so any open source project, even if it's an open source project from a big company like Google or Amazon, those two can be problematic, because that company gets to kind of decide what to do with that project, and the rest of us really don't have much say in the matter if it's owned by a company. So that's the other thing that I kind of push towards is neutral governance. So putting these projects under neutral foundations like the Linux Foundation, Apache Software Foundation, Eclipse, CNCF. There's lots of really good ones. And we do this regularly within VMware. So we have open source projects that we start, and once they start to get kind of broader adoption and other people start contributing and there starts to get kind of an interest in it, in a lot of cases, we'll contribute that to a foundation. So we've contributed some projects to the Linux Foundation, the CNCF recently. Historically, we contributed a few to the Apache Software Foundation. So it's something that I think is important, because I do think it's a risk. You look at these projects that are owned by individual companies, and it is a potential risk to your company in embracing those for, like I said, licensing and all kinds of other risks. And then there are some that are really kind of specific to the community. So we talked about, historically there were a lot more toxic communities, but you can legitimately put your employees at physical and mental risk by putting them in projects where there is a toxic environment. Another one is responsiveness. So that's another thing I look at when I look at risk. So does the community respond quickly to pull requests, issues? Do they give good feedback? Do they merge a lot of them, or do they close them without merging them? And so you can get a pretty good feel for whether you're likely to get your bug fixes or other patches contributed back upstream by looking at the responsiveness. And if they're not responsive, that's a risk, because you can end up with an awful lot of technical debt that you have to maintain yourself, because no one will merge your patches.
Okay, so you really need to look closely at the licenses, how the community works, make sure it's not toxic, and many other things. But one thing that really intrigued me is the fact that Elastic has done what they've done. Where does that leave a company like VMware? You've put a lot of time and money towards building critical software infrastructure upon this open source project. What's the next step for your company then? What do you do?
Yeah, and because VMware is large and this problem cuts across our business units, different business units are taking different approaches. Some of them are saying, I'll buy the commercial license from Elastic and just pay for it and not use an open source technology at all. We have some other business units that are embracing the Amazon AWS fork called OpenSearch, which has a few, I think, governance challenges right now. So I'm not sure that that's a great option, but it's probably the easiest option for people to embrace short term. We're actually encouraging our business units, where possible, to replace it with another technology entirely. So something like, for example, Apache Solr, which is a similar NoSQL database to Elastic, but it's under the Apache Software Foundation. So it's under a neutral foundation, and we're not going to get the rug pulled out from under us. And there might be other things we could replace it with, but we're encouraging our business units to think about replacing it with another technology.
And underlying Elastic's move, is this something because they haven't been able to really monetize the open source project? So they've got VCs and investors on their back saying, hey, look, we've invested this amount of money. It's been this amount of time. You said that you could turn this into a viable business. And so now they've kind of gone behind and against what everyone originally believed and respected them for, and have completely changed, I guess, the underlying meaning of the whole project.
That is exactly the problem. Yes. And this is why we've seen this with the companies that we've seen this with. So, we saw this with MongoDB. We saw this with Elastic. Grafana Labs was another recent example. But you look at these, what's happening is that these companies really haven't been able to monetize the open source projects that they spend a lot of time contributing to. So if you look at the contributions to projects like Elasticsearch, it's mostly people from Elastic. So they're putting all the work and effort into it. And they're realizing that people like Amazon are making all of the money off of it because they're repackaging it and offering it as a service on AWS. So Amazon is paying, Elastic, and I'm just using Amazon as an example. This happens, all the cloud providers are kind of in a similar situation. They use these open source technologies, they repackage them, and then they sell them. But they don't really have to give anything back to companies like Elastic or MongoDB or anyone else. So these little companies who are under lots of financial pressure from VCs, or I think Elastic's a public company, so from their shareholders, it's it's hard to look at somebody else making all of your money, and you're struggling to to support the company. And it's a challenge, and I'm sympathetic to the problem that they have for sure, but it's what happens when you base your entire business on a particular open source technology and don't have a good solid business model around how you're going to make money with it.
And I think you mentioned kind of what it might be a red flag to a company that is using an open source project or looking to see whether they want to use an open source project. A red flag in the sense that, hey, look, this open source project might do what Elastic did, or they might change their underlying license in the future. And the one that you mentioned was the governance structure. So I think that's what it would have been, like people actually contributing to it. It's mainly Elastic employees. Could you maybe explain a bit of how you look at that red flag and you kind of use that as an indication then to decide whether you use an open source project, and what other red flags are there for companies listening that they might be able to recognize within open source projects?
Yeah, one of the things I look at from a governance perspective is I look at other organizations that are in leadership positions, or sorry, employees from other organizations that are in leadership positions. So if you look at, I'll just use the Amazon example because that's the one I'm familiar with. You look at OpenSearch, and all of the maintainers and leaders for that project work at Amazon. And you read the forums, and there are lots of mentions of, well, we'll have to discuss that with our internal stakeholders and come back to you with a decision. So it's clearly being run like a proprietary product, but it's being run slightly more in the open. So you can see a bit of how the sausage is made, but not actually participate in the decisions of how the sausage is made. So one of the things I look at a few things with governance. So ideally, it's a neutral foundation and not a company. So that's kind of step one. Step two would be having clearly documented governance structures that outline how people move into and out of leadership positions, and having that done in a way that it's really clear. So there are things like you can put in place like contributor ladders, where you start as maybe you're triaging issues, and then you can move up to being kind of a more of a contributor who reviews other people's requests, like a reviewer, and then eventually maybe move up into a maintainer position where you're making decisions on the project, or even moving into like a leadership position, like a steering committee, for example, or a technical oversight committee, something like that. So I look for these leadership structures, and I look for organizational diversity across those leadership structures. So if I see a project where all of the leaders and all of the maintainers work for a single company, then it's pretty clear that that company is making the decisions. And especially if there's no clear path for any of our people to move into leadership positions, I am unlikely to encourage our our employees to contribute to these communities, because all you're giving them is sort of free labor and never getting to really have a seat at the table. And you do get into kind of a chicken and egg situation where you don't want to necessarily put in place like really heavy governance structures right away before you have other people contributing, but you need some structure, and you need some path and some understanding of who makes the decisions and how they're made. And I actually think that projects like OpenSearch would be better off if they were just honest about the fact that right now the decisions are being made internally within Amazon. Because what they're saying is the decisions are in the open, we do everything in the open, it's an open project. but you look at the behavior, and the behavior doesn't match the values that they say they have as a project. And I think that you get a healthier community if people come to the community knowing what they can and can't do within the community.
Okay, that makes a lot of sense, and I'm sure it would definitely be very useful for a lot of the people listening. One thing I wanted to trace back to that I know you mentioned earlier on was the fact that VMware donates a lot of its licenses to foundations. So, can you talk a little bit about that strategy? Why VMware does it? How it works?
Yeah. So I'll start by talking a little bit about how VMware approaches open source. So we look at open source as really the way to get innovation. So right now, most modern software is based on open source projects like Kubernetes, for example. So it gives us, by using some of these really common open source technologies, it gives us, faster time to market, more access to innovation, increased productivity. But you really only get those benefits if you also contribute back to these projects and collaborate with other people on these projects. So, we look at both collaborating in and building diverse communities so that we can solve our challenges, we get new opportunities, but we also are working on things that solve challenges across the whole ecosystem. And so, by building on top of these industry standard components, we have better products. We have software that's more innovative, more interoperable, more scalable, secure. But we also think that you get a lot of advantage, because you get a lot of the advantage by working with other companies. That's how you get the innovation, right? Sometimes it's better for the project to put it under a neutral foundation. So I can give you an example. So we have a few cloud native projects. So projects like Contour and Harbor, for example, which are in the CNCF ecosystem. They're cloud native technologies. They're used a lot with projects like Kubernetes. And what we found was that, we were starting to get traction. Other people were using these projects. Other people were contributing to them. And rather than trying to continue to maintain that internally at VMware, by putting it under a neutral foundation, that reduces the barriers to contribution from other companies. It increases the confidence in the project because it's not owned by a single company. It's owned by, a well-known foundation like the CNCF. And it just gives people a better experience, I think, for contributing to some of these projects. And because the CNCF has strict requirements for moving from incubating and sandbox and graduated, you run through a process that makes the project stronger. Like, you could run through that process yourself as an individual company, but by doing it with the CNCF, you just get a lot more feedback, you get a lot more people working on it. And so we see that as being a big benefit. What you give up is you give up control. So, VMware no longer controls those projects, but that's fine. We're active participants. We're still, we still have a lot of the maintainers. We still contribute, and it's okay that we don't have final say or final control over the project, because we're doing the right things for the industry as a whole. And that's the way to look at it. One of the things that we don't do is we don't do it for marketing purposes. So you see people trying to stuff things into foundations because they think that this half-dead project with, the marketing forces of a big foundation behind it will all of a sudden make this, let's face it, like really crappy project better. And that's not a solution. So we really look at it from the standpoint of wanting to innovate and work with other companies and collaborate with people as being the, what we look for when we contribute them to foundations.
I think it's definitely something I've heard a lot in the last few years is people kind of, I guess, trying to just get rid of the technical debt to their open sourcing projects. And it seems like quite a very bad strategy. I know that it was proven to be a bad strategy today, but that's all we have time for today. So thank you so much for your time, Dawn. It's been lovely chatting. And I hope we get to do this sometime in the future too.
Thanks. This was a lot of fun. I really enjoyed it.
Awesome. Well, thank you. And to everyone listening, if you like what you listened to today, then check us out on YouTube, give us a like, subscribe. And if you're listening to this on Apple Podcasts, then please leave a review letting us know what you think. So thanks very much, everyone. Thank you, Dawn. And until next time.